It was a crisp morning in downtown Chicago, the kind where the air was cold enough to sting your face, but the bustling city kept moving like a well-oiled machine. Cars zipped by, horns blared, and people rushed along the sidewalks, clutching their coffee cups and scarves. Amid the controlled chaos, there was an energy of normalcy. That's when Officer Ray Daniels rolled up in his patrol car. Ray was known around the precinct, not for his stellar work ethic or solving major cases, but for his reputation. He was the kind of cop who threw his weight around, especially when he thought he could get away with it. Today, Ray was on edge. The morning had been quiet, almost too quiet, and he didn't like it. Boredom didn't suit him, and deep down, he was always looking for action, though not always the kind that ended with justice. At the same time, across the street, Eric Matthews was stepping out of a local diner, shaking hands with the manager. Eric was sharp. His tailored suit, polished shoes, and the way he carried himself screamed confidence. He had the look of someone who knew his purpose, though he never flaunted it. Most people who saw him wouldn't guess the truth about Eric. He wasn't just another corporate type or businessman. He was an FBI agent. Eric wasn't there for breakfast or business. He was wrapping up a low-profile surveillance operation and blending in with the crowd, just as he'd been trained to do. He didn't need anyone noticing him, especially not local law enforcement. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Ray spotted Eric crossing the street. His gaze narrowed. It wasn't the tailored suit or confident stride that caught his attention. It was the color of Eric's skin. For Ray, old prejudices lingered in the shadows of his mind, surfacing in ways he couldn't, or wouldn't, control. To him, Eric didn't look like he belonged, and that was enough reason to investigate. "Hey, you!" Ray's voice cut through the din of the city, commanding and sharp. Eric paused, turning toward the sound. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Eric immediately recognized the energy. He'd seen men like Ray before, men who assumed power gave them the right to intimidate. Eric remained calm, his instincts kicking in. "Can I help you, officer?" he asked, his tone even and unbothered. Ray approached, hand resting on his utility belt, his body language oozing authority. "Yeah, what are you doing around here? You look out of place." The words were sharp, intentional, designed to provoke. Eric tilted his head, studying Ray carefully. "I'm grabbing breakfast," he replied, keeping his tone light. He had no intention of revealing his FBI badge unless absolutely necessary. Years in the field had taught him that restraint often diffused situations. But Ray wasn't looking for calm. He was looking for control. "Let me see some ID." Ray demanded, his voice growing louder. A few pedestrians slowed, glancing at the brewing scene, but most kept moving. Eric sighed inwardly. He knew where this was heading, and every fiber of his being told him to walk away. But he also knew he couldn't. With deliberate slowness, he reached for his wallet and handed over his ID. Not the FBI badge, just a standard driver's license. Ray snatched it, scrutinizing it with unnecessary intensity. "Eric Matthews, huh? What are you really doing here, Matthews?" "I already told you," Eric said evenly. "Breakfast." The tension between them thickened, the city noise fading into the background. Ray's posture stiffened, and his tone shifted, dripping with disdain. "You think you can just walk around like you own the place?" Eric's jaw tightened. He had dealt with this kind of treatment before, but it never got easier. He took a steadying breath, keeping his emotions in check. "Officer, if there's a real issue, I suggest we discuss it professionally." But Ray wasn't listening. He took a step closer, invading Eric's personal space. "You think you're better than me, huh?" Eric didn't move. He didn't flinch. His calmness only seemed to agitate Ray further. And then it happened. In a split second, Ray's frustration boiled over. He shoved Eric hard. The crowd that had been casually watching stopped in their tracks. Gasps rippled through the air as Eric stumbled back, but quickly regained his footing. For a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. Eric straightened his suit, Adjusting his ties, he looked at Ray with an expression that was equal parts disappointment and determination. The officer had no idea who he had just pushed. Eric reached into his jacket, and for a moment, Ray's hand twitched toward his holster. But what Eric pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was his badge. He held it up, the gold emblem glinting in the sunlight. "I'm Special Agent Eric Matthews," he said, his voice steady but firm. FBI. The color drained from Ray's face. The crowd murmured, some pulling out their phones to record. Eric's gaze didn't waver, and the weight of the moment pressed heavily on both men. But this was far from over. Ray's face froze, his jaw tightening as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The badge in Eric's hand wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a clear indication that he had picked the wrong fight. For a moment, his eyes darted to the crowd that had gathered. A mixture of curiosity, shock, and quiet judgment etched across their faces. Phones were out now, capturing everything. Ray knew this was bad, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. Not yet. Eric didn't move. He stood his ground, letting the badge speak for itself. His calm demeanor remained, but inside, his heart was racing. Situations like this were delicate. Pushed too hard, and they could escalate into something much worse. Let it slide, and it would only reinforce behavior that had no place in law enforcement. "What's the problem here, officer?" Eric asked again, his tone measured but with an edge of authority that hadn't been there before. He knew the game Ray was playing, and he was done letting it continue unchecked. Ray blinked, visibly rattled. "Aya, I didn't know you were FBI," he stammered, his voice softer now, but still carrying a defensive tone. "You should have said something sooner." Eric raised an eyebrow, his gaze unwavering. "I didn't need to. I was minding my business. You created the problem." Ray shifted uncomfortably, his bravado starting to crumble under the weight of the crowd's judgment and Eric's unyielding stare. But rather than acknowledge his mistake, he doubled down. "Look, I've got a job to do. We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area." Eric crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. Suspicious activity? Or just me walking down the street? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Ray struggled to find a response. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, the tension thickening with every passing second. Ray's hand twitched at his side, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not like this. Before Ray could respond, a voice cut through the crowd. "Is this how you treat everyone, Officer Daniels?" The speaker stepped forward, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression and a no-nonsense attitude. She held up her phone, clearly recording the entire interaction. "I've seen you around. You've got a reputation, don't you?" Ray's eyes darted to the woman, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. "Ma'am, I suggest you step back. This is a police matter." The woman didn't budge. "Oh, not going anywhere. I think the world needs to see how you handle police matters." Her words were laced with sarcasm, and the crowd murmured in agreement. Eric watched the exchange carefully, his mind racing. This was getting out of control, and while he appreciated the support, he didn't want to pour gasoline on an already volatile situation. He raised a hand, signaling for the woman to step back. "I appreciate your concern, ma'am," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the noise. "But I've got this." The woman hesitated, her gaze shifting between Eric and Ray before finally lowering her phone. She stepped back into the crowd, but the tension remained thick in the air. Ray straightened his posture, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Listen," he began, his tone less confrontational but still defensive. "I was just doing my job. Maybe I made a mistake. Let's just leave it at that." Eric studied him for a moment, weighing his options. This wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger, the systemic issues that allowed people like Ray to operate unchecked. But he also knew that any misstep here could have serious consequences, not just for him, but for everyone involved. "Doing your job," Eric repeated, his tone neutral but pointed. "Your job is to serve and protect, not to harass people based on how they look." Ray opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the crackle of a police radio interrupted him. A voice came through, calling for assistance on a nearby street. Ray seized the opportunity, turning away from Eric with a curt nod. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath before heading back to his patrol car. As Ray drove off, the crowd slowly began to disperse, the tension lingering in the air like a storm that had passed but left the skies grey. Eric watched him go, his mind already working through the next steps. He had dealt with situations like this before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about the confrontation, it was about the message it sent. The woman from earlier approached him, her phone still in hand. "Are you okay?" she asked, her tone softening now that the immediate danger had passed. Eric nodded. "I'm fine. Thank you for stepping in." She hesitated, glancing at the retreating patrol car. "That guy's trouble. I've seen him harass people before. You should report him." Eric gave her a small, tight smile. "I plan to." The woman nodded, seeming satisfied, and walked away, leaving Eric alone on the sidewalk. He glanced down at his badge, the gold catching the light. It was a symbol of authority, yes, but also responsibility. He couldn't let this slide, not for himself, but for everyone who had been on the receiving end of behavior like Ray's. As he turned to leave, Eric's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a text from his partner, Agent Sarah Lawson. Asterisk, asterisk, any updates? Everything good on your end, asterisk, asterisk. Eric hesitated for a moment before typing a response. Asterisk, asterisk ran into some trouble. Let's talk later. Asterisk, asterisk. He hit send and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his mind already racing with questions. Who was Ray Daniels really? Was he just another cop with a chip on his shoulder, or was there something more to his behavior? Eric had learned a long time ago that nothing in this line of work was ever as simple as it seemed. As he walked away from the scene, blending back into the bustling city, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Eric walked down the busy Chicago street, his thoughts racing faster than the taxis speeding by. The badge in his pocket felt heavier than usual, a reminder of both his responsibility and the power it carried. What just happened wasn't new to him, and that was the part that weighed the most. He'd seen officers like Ray Daniels before, arrogant, unchecked, and used to operating without consequences. But this time, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter was part of something bigger. As he turned the corner, Eric's phone buzzed again. It was Sarah, his FBI partner, calling instead of texting this time. He answered quickly, glad to hear a familiar voice. "Eric," Sarah said, her tone clipped. "You okay?" "Your text standard. Off." "I'm fine," Eric replied, glancing over his shoulder instinctively. "Had a run-in with a local cop. Nothing major, but it didn't sit right." "Define run-in," Sarah pressed, her voice dropping slightly. She knew Eric too well to let him brush things off. Eric sighed, recounting the incident in detail. He could hear Sarah's frustration growing on the other end of the line, a sharp intake of breath, when he described Ray's shove, the way the crowd had gathered, the phone's recording. "Typical," she muttered when he finished. "But we both know this can't just be ignored. What's your next move?" "I'm still figuring that out," Eric admitted. "But something tells me this isn't just about a bad cop with an attitude. There's more to it." Sarah hesitated, and Eric could tell she was thinking the same thing he was. Their current case involved corruption within local law enforcement, dirty cops tied to a network of bribes, illegal deals, and worse. Could Ray Daniels be connected? Or was this encounter just a coincidence? "Look," Sarah said finally, "let's not jump to conclusions, but it's worth digging into. We've already got leads on a few officers in this precinct. Maybe Daniels is part of the puzzle." Eric nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Agreed. I'll start by running his name through the system, see what comes up. If he's got a history, we'll find it." After hanging up, Eric made his way to the FBI field office, his mind focused on the task ahead. The building loomed ahead, its glass facade reflecting the city's endless motion. Inside, the atmosphere was just as busy. Agents rushing between desks, phones ringing, and the faint hum of printers in the background. Eric sat at his desk and pulled up the database, typing in Ray Daniels' name. The search results popped up quickly, and he leaned forward, scanning the screen. At first glance, Ray's record looked clean. Too clean. No complaints, no disciplinary actions, nothing out of the ordinary. But Eric had learned long ago that what wasn't on paper often spoke louder than what was. He dug deeper, pulling up reports from Ray's precinct. As he sifted through case files and incident logs, a pattern began to emerge. Ray's name appeared frequently in reports involving minor altercations, most of which were dismissed with little follow-up. Several of the individuals involved were from minority communities, their statements eerily similar to Eric's own experience, claims of unwarranted stops, aggressive behavior, and intimidation. Eric's pulse quickened. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to warrant further investigation. He flagged the files and sent them to Sarah with a brief note. Asterisk, asterisk. Take a look. This guy's got a trail. Might be connected to our case after all. Asterisk, asterisk. While waiting for her reply, Eric leaned back in his chair, his mind returning to the encounter with Ray. The shove, the dismissive tone, the way he'd tried to intimidate Eric despite the badge. It wasn't just arrogance. It was the kind of behavior that came from knowing you could act without consequences. But why? What gave Ray that kind of confidence? Across town, Ray Daniels sat in his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His jaw clenched as he replayed the incident in his mind. He knew he messed up, but admitting it wasn't an option. Not to himself, and certainly not to anyone else. The badge gave him authority, and in his eyes that authority meant he was above scrutiny. But now there was a problem. Eric Matthews wasn't just another civilian he could push around. He was FBI, and that meant trouble. Ray's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. The name on the caller ID made his stomach drop. Captain Harris. Daniels, the voice on the other end, barked as soon as he answered. What the hell happened out there today? I've got complaints coming in, videos circulating online. Do you have any idea what kind of mess you've caused? Ray swallowed hard, his throat dry. It was a misunderstanding, sir. I thought the guy was suspicious. And... Save it, Harris interrupted. Do you know who he is? FBI, Daniels. You picked a fight with an FBI agent. Do you have any idea how bad this looks for the department? Ray didn't respond. What could he say? He knew he crossed a line, but the captain's anger only added to his frustration. He wasn't used to being questioned, let alone reprimanded. Listen to me, Harris continued, his tone lowering. I'm telling you this as a warning. Lay low. Keep your head down. If Matthews decides to file a complaint or dig into your record, you're on your own. Got it? Ray nodded, though the captain couldn't see him. Yes, sir, he muttered. Harris hung up, leaving Ray alone in the silence of his car. His mind churned with a mix of anger and unease. He wasn't worried about his record. He'd made sure it was clean, thanks to the right connections. But Eric Matthews was a wild card, and wild cards had a way of ruining carefully laid plans. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the city in shades of orange and gold, Eric and Ray found themselves on parallel paths, each digging deeper into the other's world. For Eric, it was a quest for justice, a chance to expose the rot beneath the surface. For Ray, it was about survival, protecting the life he'd built and the secrets he couldn't afford to let out. Neither of them knew how far the other was willing to go, but both sensed that this was only the beginning. Eric's instincts told him he was on the right track, but he also knew that digging into a local cop's record, especially one with Ray Daniels' reputation, was a delicate task. Every move had to be calculated, every lead double-checked. If this tied into the larger corruption case his team had been building for months, it was bigger than just Ray's actions on the street. It could crack open a network of bad actors who'd been hiding in plain sight. By the time Sarah walked into Eric's office with a stack of printed reports, the tension in the air was palpable. She placed the files on his desk, her expression grim. "You were right," she said, sitting across from him. "Daniels isn't clean. He's just been careful, too careful. But I found something." Eric leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as Sarah pulled a few pages from the pile. "He's tied to Officer Garrett, one of the names we flagged last week. Garrett's been under investigation for months for taking kickbacks from known traffickers. Daniels doesn't show up directly in the financials, but there's a pattern. They worked a lot of the same cases that magically went nowhere." Eric studied the documents, his mind racing. Garrett was already a known link in their corruption investigation, but if Ray was involved too, it meant their net was bigger than they'd anticipated. What about his precinct? Anyone else connected? Sarah nodded. "I've got 2 more names. Officers Linton and Hernandez. Both have similar patterns in their case histories. Complaints, excessive force allegations, sudden drops in investigations involving high-profile suspects. This isn't just a few bad apples, Eric. It's a system." Eric rubbed his temples, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. It wasn't surprising, but it was infuriating. Every name they uncovered was another reminder of how deep the rot went, how many people were being failed by those sworn to protect them. "Let's focus on Daniels for now," Eric said. "He's the one we've got recent contact with, and he's already under pressure. If we can rattle him enough, he might lead us to the others." Sarah hesitated. "You think he's a weak link?" Eric met her gaze. "He's arrogant. Guys like him always think they're untouchable until they're not. And he already knows I'm watching." Meanwhile, across town, Ray sat at the bar of a dimly lit pub, nursing his 3rd whiskey of the night. The events of the day replayed in his mind, each detail gnawing at him. He had been on edge ever since Captain Harris's call, and now his nerves were getting the better of him. He couldn't afford any loose ends. Not now. A figure slid onto the stool next to him, and Ray tensed. He didn't recognize the man, but the sharp suit and calm demeanor told him enough. This wasn't a casual encounter. "You've had quite the day," the man said, his voice low and smooth. "You made quite the impression on Agent Matthews." Ray's head snapped toward him, his heart pounding. "Who the hell are you?" The man smiled faintly, leaning closer. "Think of me as a friend. A friend who's here to remind you that you have a lot to lose if you're not careful." Ray swallowed hard, his grip tightening around his glass. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," the man replied, his tone never wavering. "You've been sloppy, Daniels. Drawing attention to yourself. That's not what we need right now." Ray's pulse quickened. Whoever this man was, he knew too much. He knew about Garrett, about the kickbacks, about everything Ray had spent years hiding. "What do you want?" "Simple," the man said, standing and adjusting his cuffs. "Keep your head down, stay away from Matthews, and remember who you answer to." As the man walked away, Ray sat frozen, his mind racing. He'd always known there were people higher up pulling the strings, but this was the first time he'd been directly confronted. It was a warning and a threat. Back at the FBI office, Eric and Sarah worked late into the night, piecing together the threads of their investigation. Each connection they uncovered brought them closer to the truth, but also revealed just how dangerous their adversaries were. These weren't just rogue officers acting independently. This was an organized network with layers of protection. By morning, Eric had a plan. "We need to put pressure on Daniels," he told Sarah. "Get him off balance. If he's protecting someone, we'll make him nervous enough to slip." Sarah nodded, already pulling up Ray's schedule. "He's on patrol today. We can track him, see who he's meeting. If he's nervous, he'll make a mistake." Eric grabbed his coat, his jaw set. Let's see how untouchable he really is. As they left the office, the weight of what they were walking into hung heavy between them. The stakes had never been higher, and neither of them could afford to make a wrong move. But deep down, Eric knew that they were getting closer to the heart of the corruption, and closer to a confrontation that would change everything. Eric and Sarah drove through the city, their unmarked car blending seamlessly with the morning traffic. The plan was simple enough: monitor Ray Daniels, see who he interacted with, and wait for a crack in his carefully constructed facade. But Eric couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get more complicated. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous this became, and the encounter with Ray had already painted a target on his back. Sarah tapped away on her laptop, tracking Ray's patrol car through the GPS they'd tapped into overnight. "He's parked near an industrial area on the south side," she said, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "Not exactly a hot of crime. What's he doing out there?" Eric frowned, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "That's not his usual beat, is it?" "Nope," Sarah replied, glancing at him. "But guess what's nearby? A warehouse we flagged in the Garrett investigation. It's listed under a shell company, but we suspect it's a meeting spot for their deals." Eric's stomach churned. This wasn't just a coincidence. Ray was moving into territory that tied directly to their case, and if he was meeting someone at that warehouse, it could be the break they needed, or a trap. They parked a few blocks away, staying out of sight, but with a clear view of the warehouse entrance. Eric adjusted his earpiece, keeping his eyes on the building as he spoke. "We need to play this carefully. If he's meeting someone, they might have people watching. We can't risk tipping them off." Sarah nodded, her attention shifting between the warehouse and her laptop. "Agreed. I'll run a check on the vehicles parked outside, see if we can tie them to any known suspects." Minutes turned into an hour, the tension thickening as they watched Ray's patrol car remain stationary. Just as Eric began to wonder if they'd miscalculated, the warehouse doors creaked open. A black SUV pulled out, followed by Ray's patrol car. "Here we go," Eric muttered, starting the engine. He followed a safe distance, weaving through traffic to avoid suspicion. Sarah kept her laptop balanced on her knees, pulling up traffic cameras to get additional angles. "They're heading toward the west side," she said. "Looks like they're sticking to main roads for now." But something felt off. The SUV wasn't trying to shake them, and Ray's car wasn't behaving like someone trying to avoid detection. It was too casual, too open. Eric's instincts screamed that this wasn't just a routine follow. Then, without warning, the SUV took a sharp turn into an alley, and Ray's car slammed to a halt in the middle of the street, blocking their path. Before Eric could react, two men stepped out of the SUV, each carrying what looked like tools, but their movements were too precise, their demeanor too controlled. These weren't workers. Sarah's voice was tense. "Eric, this feels like an ambush." Eric reached for his badge and firearm, his eyes locked on the men approaching their car. But before he could make a move, Ray stepped out of his patrol car, his hand raised to signal the men to stop. Eric rolled down his window slightly, keeping his movements deliberate. "Daniels," he called out, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" Ray smirked, his usual bravado back in full force. "You tell me, Agent Matthews. Seems like you're taking a lot of interest in my patrol route today." Eric didn't flinch. "Just doing my job, Daniels. Something you might want to try." Ray's smirk faded, replaced by a glare. He took a step closer, his voice low enough that only Eric and Sarah could hear. "You don't know what we're getting into. Walk away while you still can." Eric met his gaze, unflinching. "For what? You'll make another mistake in broad daylight." For a moment, it seemed like Ray might lash out, but then he stepped back, nodding to the men by the SUV. They returned to their vehicle, and Ray got back into his patrol car, driving off without another word. The SUV followed, leaving Eric and Sarah alone in the street. Sarah exhaled sharply. "That was too close. He knows we're watching." Eric nodded, his jaw tight. "And he's trying to scare us off. Whatever he's involved in, it's big enough that they're willing to risk being that bold. We can't let up now." But as they continued their surveillance, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that Ray's warning wasn't just a bluff. There was something deeper at play, something that went beyond corruption and bribes. Ray wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting something or someone much bigger. And whoever it was, they had no intention of letting Eric and Sarah get any closer.